All right. Well, this is the commemorative time in the winter evenings when the dusk is so pronounced and the waxing gibbous moon has made its presence felt. It has announced itself to us in the sky a couple of nights ago, so it's a waxing moon. It is the Urs of Rumi. It is the night that the dervishes turn. Now, and I guess it's for that reason then that we're here. Well, this is just part of the background of what the address this evening involves, what the address does involve, and it's about turning. If we speak of the dervishes and their turning, and if we speak of the turn, 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 to everything there is a turn, 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 the turning of the seasons, is it not so that equinox is also upon us? And so it is entirely appropriate in a timely sense, in a temporal sense, in the transient cycle of circumstances for us to consider as our subject this evening. One Jalaluddin Muhammad, Mevlana Jalaluddin Muhammad is the name of the individual who was born in 1206 in Balkh, what is now Afghanistan, and born into a family of prominent scholarly jurists. He's Mevlana um, uh, Jalaluddin Muhammad. That is his given name, you see, and he comes to be known as Rumi because the name for the Anatolian Peninsula, the Byzantine name for it was Eastern Rome. It was considered that from the other side of the world than we're normally used to looking at it from, and because from Balkh, Rumi Jalaluddin Muhammad, who became Rumi. Left at about, he was probably 13 or so when his family pulled up stakes. There was a lot of stuff happening at that time. And most notably, the horsemen of Genghis Khan thundering down on so many fronts in that entire region, spread across vast distances, so that by 1220, um, the Shah, the Khwarizm Shah of Balkh, made a foolish decision when he punished a messenger from one of the Mongolian detachments and brought ruin down upon Balkh. It was overrun, and but by that time, though, Rumi and his family were gone. They left some 2 or 3 years before that, perhaps having foreseen the danger, and like a great many. They traveled through the rest of the Islamic world. He spent time in Syria, in Mecca, in Baghdad. Eventually, they settled in Turkey, what is now Turkey, in Anatolia. Eventually, settling in Konya, the prosperous capital city of the Seljuk Turks, the Seljuk dynasty, who ruled at that time. And there, Rumi's father, Baha Volad, continued to teach and adjudicate and contribute to the community in that way in Konya. And when he passed away, it fell to his son Jalaluddin. And so it was that after further studies in Syria, studying jurisprudence as well as religious scriptures, as well as Quran, as well as Hadith, and also, of course, Sufism. He came to Konya and was established in his career and was teaching there and practicing there. And about 1244, was it? About 1244 in October, at the tavern of the sugar merchants at the edges of Konya. There passed through those districts a wandering dervish named Shams of Tabriz. And this was not not all that phenomenal a thing at that time. There were those dervishes, followers of the Sufi way, and they were in all walks of life, and their approach to things, the Sufis, the dervishes, was based upon or founded in kind of what you might consider to be an intuitive search for God, of the reality of God. And there was from time to time a certain kind of quality or characteristic they had in which where they distinguished themselves or put themselves in a different kind of dimensional understanding than that of the orthodox religion and religionists of the time. And they were, there was, well, it's difficult to describe in one or two sentences the nature of the ferment and the way that all of these ideas were contributing to each other in all kinds of cosmopolitan places, Konya among them, and all along the Silk Road, where ideas were passing back and forth before the minds of thoughtful individuals. And in Alexandria, which was at the fringes, the western fringes of that world, there first hundreds of years before, there was a teacher named Plotinus, a Hellenist, a teacher of the out of the tradition of Plato and Aristotle. But Plotinus, you understand, in his teachings was very kind of very, very open-ended in what he considered to be the nature of reality, and at the same time as it is open-ended, meaning open to interpretation, it's so close, it seeks to provide or to offer a description so close to the actual experience within of divine understanding that it presents itself to the world as a kind of a contemplative metaphysic. There were others before, and of course there are all kinds of others after, but for Plotinus, the thing was that being and the cosmos and the world was a series of emanations from a source, a single source. He called that single source the One. And the One uttered forth the principle of the intellect, and the intellect uttered forth as an image of itself into a sensual medium into the world. There came then the soul as an emanation of the intellect, which was itself an emanation of the One. So it's the One, the intellect, and the soul. And this is the basic tripartite structure of the cosmos. And as you might guess, an entire world is contained in this. And the energy of this open-ended teaching was such that it nourished the understanding of those in other cultural domains and other religious domains who were interested in coming to understand what was the truth about their own notion of God and of the soul and of the spirit. And it allowed for a certain understanding, a certain light from a certain kind of a certain world that served to be a very liberating influence in the minds and in the imaginations of those such as the Sufis, you see. And, well, so there were correspondingly Sufis in all walks of life, in all degrees of orthodoxy, and all degrees of conventional practice of the tenets of Islam. And this allowed, in certain cases, in certain times and places, for a wide array of different forms of the behavior that might take. And so there were these wandering mendicant dervishes who wandered from place to place, and perhaps some were beggars, and some might be hermits, and some might be itinerant preachers, and some might be well-respected teachers, and some might be madzubs, which is their word for the fools, who sometimes became the favorite of the kings in their courts, and other times lived in the poorer quarters of town and slept in the doorways. The word dervish itself means doorway. This Shams of Tabriz, he was a mendicant dervish traveling around. He was staying for a time in the hostel or the guest house of the sugar merchants at the edges of Konya in October of 1244. Rumi was passing by. He was about 37 years old, Jalaluddin Muhammad. He was riding on a horse. He was probably in between classes or in between lectures. And this Shams of Tabriz came up to him and grasped the bridle of his horse and called out to him, "O leader of the Muslims, who is greater, the Prophet or Bayazid? Who is greater, the Prophet who said," speaking of God, to God, "we do not know you as well as we should," as opposed to Bayazid, who did not stop at that kind of like should or should not, but actually said, "I am God, how great I am, how great is my glory." Who is greater? Asked Shams of Tabriz to Rumi. Who is greater, O leader of the Muslims? Who is greater, Jalaluddin or the Prophet Muhammad? And as Shams, as as Rumi later told, he said, at that moment when I was asked this question, who is greater, the Prophet or Bayazid, it was as if a fire, it was as if from above the seven heavens came crashing down upon the earth, causing a great conflagration, which flamed up into my brain and up past my brain onto the throne of God. And I found myself saying in reply, amidst this vision, amidst this seizure, amidst this possession, amidst this towering fit of visionary ideation, though he did not describe it in that way, but amidst this vision, I said to this mendicant dervish, I said, no one is greater than the Prophet. Now consider Bayazid, who said, I am great, how great is my glory, I am God. Well, that sounds extravagantly fantastical, and he sounds more satisfied than Muhammad ever was. But consider, Bayazid was thirsty, took one drink, and had his thirst quenched. Bayazid was as one whose house was filled with light from the single skylight of his own dwelling. Whereas the Prophet Muhammad, he thirsted for more thirst. No amount of sustenance and inspiration for him would be that which would satisfy his ultimate desire to realize the truth of God, the wordless truth of God, on behalf of himself and on behalf of the world and on behalf of his people. He was thirsty for more thirst. Bayazid was satisfied with a single draught of the waters of life. He was able to say something to Shams of Tabriz, which caused Shams of Tabriz in turn to have a seizure, and Shams of Tabriz collapsed, And Rumi ordered that he be taken to one of the houses in the school and where he be cared for until he kind of came to. And when he came to a short time later, Rumi and Shams became inseparable. And this is part of the legend of Rumi. This is one of the turnings of the phenomenon that we celebrate on December 17th, on the night of Rumi's Urs, upon the time when he shuffled off the mortal coil, on the night of unity. The word Urs means wedding. This was actually the night that Rumi passed away in 1273, I think 750 years ago from tonight. And this is part of the legend. He met Shams of Tabriz. They spoke in these incandescent terms to each other. And you might think, what is with these people? I mean, in modern terms, it's we have to give it a certain allowance, for the certain style of storytelling in which these things are related. There are these towering fits of inspiration or imagination that supersede the normal dimensions of human decorum or cultural decorum. And so these people, have these extreme reactions or responses to the things they hear, which open doors within their minds and in their understandings. And this becomes part of the legend. This becomes part of the turning of Rumi. Eventually, of course, the legend tells us that Shams disappeared, never came back. And some say, and it's a credible account, perhaps he was murdered by a jealous student, perhaps even by Rumi's second son. This is unknown, this is part of the legend, but after that, Rumi wandered around all distraught. And it was then that his utterances became so memorable. The poetry poured out of him. And it's collected, they call his works odes. They call them ghazals. It's an Arabic poetic form. They call them quatrains. These are a certain form, a certain kind of poetic work, which his utterances take the form of, and they involve the longing and the separation from Shams, and they evoke this feeling of seeing the presence of actual divinity in the face of a human being, and being on intimate terms in every human way, and yet it having more of the cosmos in it than anything that he had ever experienced before, and poems of longing and separation and of heartbreak, and also of ecstatic kind of spiritual union. And this is, is it possible to say Rumi has been well known in the Western world for many hundreds of years, especially in since Goethe and since the European Romantics, and also since the British Victorian times. There were travelers and translators, some of them in the British military, who did extensive and selfless and devoted work in compiling all of these mystical treatises from all of the Sufis, and putting them into English in these sometimes Victorian translations. And Rumi appears everywhere here, and that is how his works become known to us. And this is part of our recent history, our recent cultural history, since the 1970s, when free verse poetry for the page, it was kind of like a certain kind of coin was struck that became local and contemporary currency, and was a great contribution. And when it was found that Rumi's odes and quatrains and ghazals and their themes of longing and separation and union could be translated or rendered into or interpreted as American free verse poetry in a contemporary sense by a great many authors, why, this became kind of a new flowering, perhaps you could even say on a social level, a new turning by which the thought of Rumi becomes available to readers, on the contemporary scene. And so this was another turning when his understanding of things could be put into such contemporary terms. And it is in this way that a lot of us have become acquainted with Rumi. But there's always, as in the works of any primal work of genius, all these facets lead to other facets. It's a many-faceted jewel, and you turn it a certain way and it glimmers a different way. Or when the sun in the sky shines on it a different way, you see a whole different aspect of it. And so, as well as being a lyric poet par excellence, able to grab the ears of the contemporary poetry audiences from the 1970s on, Rumi is also, of course, a teacher, steeped in his own religion, and practicing in the time-honored way of practicing and teaching, and very much operative in the context of his times, which parts of that we want to get and know all about, and other parts still kind of elude us and actually challenge our imagination to kind of, if we want to really take another step further into our understanding of Rumi, we might want to consider looking at him in such a context, because then we can step closer in intimacy, even stepping away from notions of the poetry on the page or notions of a famous and well-known, cultural figure, but maybe into a deeper reflection of what it is in us that beckons us to look in works of literature in order to find our own understanding of truth or divinity or God or any of these ultimate subjects. And so we can look at Rumi in the context of his day-to-day life. This rapturous utterer of phrases, which can be recited even today in sing-song, vacant kind of mystical New Age ways, is actually also very much speaking of life in the most humble terms and the most common of circumstances, because the ways of God surely are known to those whose minds have transcended, but transcendence itself is only one particular turning, you see. And so because of this, Rumi spoke in the context of a teacher, of a jurist, of a storyteller, of an advisor to his family and to others in his community. And all of it, or a great deal of it, was written down by those around him. And this is another aspect of Rumi's literary work, is like Buddha, like Jesus, like Socrates, like so many, their works they're not writers per se, because there are no written works written in their own hand. It's more the literary works have come to us by being taken down by those around them. And because of that, there's a whole lot of room, actually. It's a different thing than what a print poet of the 1970s would base their reputation on. There's something different that is happening there in the nature of poetry and in the nature of the mysterious ways that poetry is. And poetry being inspired utterance, basically, as well as in what Rumi has to say in terms of what we usually are somewhat squeamishly, reluctant to call religious terms. And so because of that, there's a lot of contemporary prejudices that you can see mirrored in the way that people approach Rumi despite their great excitement. There are certain things about it that sometimes, I'm not trying to add controversy to it, really. It's not a matter of controversy, but it is these kind of things. He's talking about God. And so when you talk about God, what kind of considerations suddenly come up? Well, and what ways do people find or rationalize to cover up the things, or to turn away from turning? That's another kind of turning, actually, to turn away from the things that would make them would be harder to control. But such is the nature of ideas. Different things are volatile at different times. So, that being said, we can consider what does Rumi teach us, or what does Rumi offer us now, and how we are to consider the experience of ultimate things inside of ourselves, amidst all the terms of religious terms, and all of the terms, which some of them are so heavy, some of them are so freighted, some of them are so weighted down. Well, so I'll have to talk about that. Let me, since I've talked about poetry, let me read some writing from myself that's kind of like poetry. I don't know, but it's a way to elucidate, if that's the word, my theme here. For some, it may be good to offer a way to imagine a God as a character. For others, a God may be more abstract, a thought, or feeling, or emotion. For others, it may be offered that God is neither out there nor in here, but we are among God, like moving in a crowd. Maybe we are in God, or moving in a crowd, perhaps as if we were moving in a crowd, or parting veils, veil after veil, or entering into the pattern of, or entering into the forest of, the labyrinth of, or stepping through the doorway of. This could be a useful metaphor. Dervish, as I mentioned, means doorway. You step over a threshold, and then you are in a different dimension of understanding. And then God is no longer an image of the intellect, especially of the cribbed way we understand the intellect, in these latter years, but an actual image or being or energy felt by the soul. You see, so we enter through that doorway into a different dimension, and maybe we're talking about it in that way. For others, maybe it is good to demonstrate a kind of conceptual freedom involving a field of divine energy, or like a holy ghost of no known quantity, and ghost can mean whatever you want it to mean, right? And hope that it's a good meaning. But some people are caught up, it must be said, when it comes to notions of God, with the way they look to themselves, and the way they look at themselves, and the way they look at each other as images of themselves and of each other. And this is a great stumbling block. This is the division that people speak of, maybe, when they talk of the difficulty of speaking in terms of religion. And this is not unknown, actually. This could be considered a contemporary issue, but when you begin to look at it from the perspective of an inner kind of intuitive perspective, you see that there are many ways this resistance of understanding is played out and appears, you see. And in the context of his community, Rumi, as a literary contributor, as a great source of literary wealth, we can also understand, just like this notion of God is so vast, well, this notion of literature and story and event is also so vast. Rumi, as a storyteller, the material that is part of his Mathnawi, there's his odes, his quatrains, his ghazals, and then his science of oneness, he calls it, the Mathnawi, which is a vast work they're more like teaching poems, and they're more like story poems, and they are metaphysical digressions, scraps of conversation, many, many digressions, each element of it contributing to this vast theme, of the mysterious and multiplicative ways of divinity in the world. Well, that's the Mathnawi, this great literary work, but the source material was there before. Rumi was picking up what was available to him. Rumi, too, the great originator, was also a tailor and a patchwork worker and a maker of things to be passed on. This in and of itself was part of his creative work, you see. So it's no surprise that a great many religious figures appear in the Mathnawi, and a great deal of the Quran, in which a great many religious figures appear. And also note that what the Western monotheists, are the people of the book, and the book. And there are many shared characters. Isa bin Maryam is Jesus, son of Mary. Musa is Moses. There are a great many. Jonas is Jonah, of Jonah in the whale. It goes on, of course. And some of the themes and situations are very similar, right? Moses, atop the great mountain, saw the burning bush and beheld written in stone the law of God. Moses became a leader and a ruler and a paragon and an authority. Moses was traveling in the desert. Moses came upon a beautiful oasis-like place, and it was dusk, and there were olive trees growing. There was water nearby, and there was a flock of sheep. And there was a shepherd, a young man with shoulder-length hair, dancing and playing the flute. and he was playing a beautiful and ancient shepherd's song. Moses watched. This is a story, by the way, from the Mathnawi. This is a story, by the way, from Rumi. Moses watched, and when the song was done, the shepherd put the flute away, and then the shepherd began to pray. And this is how he prayed. The shepherd said, "O God, where are you? Tell me. O God, I long to hold you in my arms and groom you and comb your hair and pick the lice out. O God, I long to set you down by the campfire and make you a meal of corn flour and fresh olives and greens. I love to feed you in the morning the goat's milk, fresh from the udders of the goats. I love to fetch you water from the clear running streams. O God, where are you? Tell me. I long to be your servant. And at night time I will sing lullabies to you. I will whisper bedtime stories to you. And then I will go and clean the house, and I will sweep the floor, and I will darn your socks and mend your shoes and patch your jacket." At this point, Moses was listening the whole time. And Moses had had enough. Moses stepped out from behind the rock, perhaps where he had been concealed from sight. And Moses said to the shepherd, "Who are you talking to?" And the shepherd said, I am talking to the one involved in my most intimate daily activity. I am talking to the one who makes the birds sing in the trees and gives me ears to hear them. I am talking to the one who makes the flowers bloom and gives me a nose to smell them. I am the one to whom I am nothing but dust on the road. I am the one to offer him all my adoration in every thought and in every detail of my life. And, well, Moses couldn't stand it anymore. This was not right. Moses said, "This is blasphemy. You are speaking as if God was a person, as if God was one who lived and died, as if God was one whose hair would get tangled, as if God had lice that you would pick out. This is not appropriate. Shepherd, don't pray this way, never talk this way." And he struck him with his staff. Not so hard to hurt him, of course, but everything he had said went through the shepherd like a bolt. The shepherd looked off into the distance, and where he had seen before beautiful hills, he saw endless vistas of swirling dust. He suddenly saw a landscape that all the life, all the color had dropped out of it. Suddenly everything around him was made desolate. But Moses had said what he wanted to say, and Moses turned away and left the shepherd standing there. And Moses had taken a few steps away when Moses, in his turn, was chastised by the voice of God. God spoke to Moses. "Moses, are you not my servant? Look at what you have done to your fellow servant of God. Moses, you have divided me from one of my own. Every soul is given according to their understanding a way of belief and a way of worship that fits their own understanding and their own character and their own life. And you have stepped in between that and caused that one to drop away. Moses, you have sundered me from one of my own." And at first Moses, he did say to God, "How can it be?" I was speaking to him to remind him that God is an infinite being. And he was speaking as if God were not an intimate being, as if God were a thing that shared his daily life. And Moses said, "You don't understand. I have put out a different ladder for every soul to come to me in their own way." God said that to Moses. God said, "Their worship, in a certain sense, means nothing to me. I do not need their worship. I am the all-nourisher. I do not need their worship. Instead, I offer the worship as a gift to them, so that, in the terms of their own minds, they can come to know me better in a way that involves turning and turning and turning again. And you have disrupted that process. And so, these words from God were all that Moses needed to feel truly contrite. Moses, what have I done? I must go back and make amends. I must do the right thing. Moses was determined, of course, to do the right thing. That he was Moses after all. And he turned around and he went back, but he couldn't find the shepherd anywhere. He couldn't see the sheep. He didn't know where they had gone. Moses went out into the desert himself. He went out into the desert to look for the shepherd so that he could speak to him, so that he could tell him he was sorry, so that he could make amends. And Moses himself in the desert, he became a wanderer of sorts. He was looking only for the footsteps of that shepherd. And eventually he did find them. He did find the footsteps of the shepherd. He saw the footsteps in the sand. But he could tell that they were the footsteps of a distraught and bewildered and confused man. The steps sometimes of one wandering in the desert, sometimes zigzagging, sometimes looping around, and sometimes wandering in circles, and sometimes, according to the markings of his feet in the sand, staggering, and sometimes falling down. Yes, he could see knee prints and hand prints also, and sometimes getting up again, and crawling and slithering and sliding and walking and wandering. He knew that these were the footsteps of one who had gone from one dimension of knowing and perhaps was going toward another. At least he could follow the footsteps now. Moses could. He could follow the footsteps of that shepherd across the desert. And they came to a mountain. And Moses climbed the mountain, following the footsteps up the mountain. And when he got to the top of the mountain, just as he rounded over the rock, he saw the shepherd standing at the edge of a cliff, and he called out, "Shepherd, shepherd, it is me, Moses, I am back. I regret terribly the things that I told you. Worship God in your own way." Your uniqueness as a worshiper of God is a very reflection of the bounty and true being of God. Please accept my apologies for disrupting that tender thread, that intricate thread of connection. And the shepherd turned around at the edge of the cliff. And in the entire desert was behind the shepherd. And Moses looked at the shepherd, and who knows how much time had passed. It could have been moments or hours or days. But looking at the face of the shepherd, it seemed like years. Moses, looking at the face of the shepherd, it seemed like he was gazing into many, many lifetimes that had crossed over the face of this shepherd. And looking into the shepherd's eyes, you could see dimension after dimension of divine desolation. And the shepherd said to Moses in a voice much changed, more resonant with the vastness, the vast hollowness, and yet also the vast fullness of divine being. Moses was told in turn by the shepherd. The shepherd said to Moses, "Moses, you put your staff to the horse of my body. The horse of my body shied away. But so did my mind, and then my mind went beyond that. And you brought my mind into further and further dimensions. Veil after veil, all at once, dropped away from my understanding. Veil after veil dropped away. I went deeper and deeper and deeper into a reality that I could not name, that words had no place for, and I wandered on in utter bewilderment and confusion, and yet a union with everything that we strive for. Oh, Moses, I feel grateful to you, said the shepherd to Moses. So Moses realized as he turned away, this is something that can only happen in the life with human beings, in the common life with human beings. This is an understanding of reality given to me, a further turning of my understanding of what is true. And this then is also a story told by Rumi. I have it's changed over the years in all of the different ways, because now I want to say this about those many anecdotes and legends and myths and Quranic recitations that are in Rumi's Mathnawi, that these came before. These came through the doorway of Rumi from farther back in time, and then they went on from Rumi, and then through the doorway of countless troubadours and tellers, you see. So there is a turning of the wisdom of Rumi that we can understand when we step further into the poetry, into the phenomenon, and into the figure, and into the legend, and to the myth of Rumi. We can see there's that blessedly, things are not as they seem. We can find more and more of dimensions of this nature. Let me talk then about the turning a little bit, and the dervishes and their turning. I spoke of some of his other names, Mevleva, Jalaluddin, Muhammad. And Mevleva means, it's an honorific, it's an honorable title. It could mean like master. Mullah means reverend. Mevleva could be like a Turkish kind of take on that, so to speak, of a certain kind. It's a title of honor. And after Rumi passed away, the community of Sufis around him, there came a further kind of a crystallization of their form, or a further refinement of their organization. After Rumi passed away, then there were the Mevlevi dervishes. And the Mevlevi dervishes are it's an order of dervishes that's all over the world, and they still exist today, of course. But they are the ones whom we associate with the whirling. They're the ones who made it a special kind of quality, or a special kind of action in their worship and in their meditation. Even though there has always been moving meditation and moving worship and dance and song, all of this has been ways where the body as well as the mind can be harmonized to the turning ways that the universe works, and the movements of the body in space as well as in time can come to bring the individual seeker further into alignment with the energies of the cosmos. And dance and prayer and as well as literature and music, all these things are all these arts, then are integrated into the total kind of life, the life form of the individual who is interested in such things in this way, in these kind of cultures, with these kind of cultural riches being offered. And the Mevlevi dervishes, then, they became ones who made they call it Sameh. Sameh is the general word to refer to the dance and to the turning, the whirling. Sameh, it's a ceremony which involves the musical turning. But the word itself means actually listening. It could also mean further musical listening. It could also mean audiation. It could also mean sounding. It involves a certain faculty of the soul that is, its outer representation is the hearing of the ears. But we know, there is that old phrase, your wish in God's ear. That's in a lot of the monotheistic traditions. Your wish in God's ear. God said kun, which is the Arabic word for be. Or God said, let there be light. God said, let there be light. And there was this resonation. So it's like the primordial manifestation of the will of God is represented as sound, you see. And so audiation then becomes a kind of a way of worship. And so Sameh can mean audiation, but they dance. So it's like it's a dance that you hear, you see. This is the whirling. It is a dance of the spheres. Let me return to what Plotinus was talking about as a way to understand this process. Now, though it is said, a great deal of legendary material about Rumi is said about the origination of the turning, of the whirling, as the dervishes practice it. One of them is that Rumi was wandering distraught in the bazaars of Konya, and he went past the pavilions or the booths or the workshops of the goldsmiths or the silversmiths or the blacksmiths or the tinsmiths or the hammerers or the smiths of iron in the forges, and he heard the tap, tap, tapping and the ring, ring, ringing of the hammers, and this gave him a certain rhythm in which he began to move. And there was a pillar nearby, a pillar holding up a roof perhaps, or a tent pole even, and he began to go around that. And this began to be, oh, and then he began to like utter ecstatic lines of poetry as he went around them. That's one of the legendary possibilities. But it could also be that, of course, yes, the people have always danced and the people have always moved in a way, because this is a form of movement that is very natural to people. The turning. Anyway, so, but if the universe is considered by Plotinus and given to the world, this conception in its open-ended way, to consist of emanations from the one, the emanation of the one being the intellect, the emanation of the intellect being the soul. And the intellect and the soul are utterly interdependent and dependent upon each other. But the one, however, is unique, wholly in itself. But in the turning, then we have the returning. And so what happens in the imagination of the dancing dervish, there is the turning. It seems that there's like a form, and I'm only interpreting it in the most general kind of way, but just to suggest what's going on here, as well as the writing of the words upon the page and the reverberation of the ideas in the sentences in our ear, and the seeing with our outer eye of the dervishes in their costumes. The dervishes wear white skirts to signify the shroud of the grave. The dervishes wear black tunics to symbolize, the width and the space of the grave. The shroud that wraps the dead is the skirt. The tunic symbolizes the grave. And then there's the hat, which symbolizes the pivot, or the I'm sure that it symbolizes a great many things. But there's that tall hat made of pressed felt, and then the turning begins. It's the left foot is what anchors one to the ground and to the things of the earth and the world, and then the right foot begins to pivot around it in a counterclockwise way. And if the foot is rooted too rigidly, the turning won't happen. And if the right foot moves too enthusiastically, one might stumble, you see. And then how does it go now? I've only read about it or seen, videos of it. The right hand goes up to receive, and then the left hand is down to bestow the blessing. And then there's the turning, and there's the turning. And then there's the music of the ney, that particular kind of flute, the improvisational lines of the ney. I think Mevlevi composers in the 16th centuries, there were several of them. They composed a great many, patterns of music, and then it's an improvisatory nature. I'm sure, like so much of music of all kinds can be. And then there's also the drum, various kinds of drums, and then there are the chants, various vocalizations. Involving any of the 101 or 99 qualities of Allah, of God. Because it's true, Moses wasn't kidding when he said that God is known by God's qualities, of love and generosity and magnificence and wisdom and mildness and healing and severity and goodness and justice and all of this. But these are the qualities of God, and God in God's own self, are these things. But we, as human beings, we're living in a world of time and space, bounded by our physical forms. And so, though we might glimpse, in whatever way, the reality of these abstract forms, we still require, the mediation of prayer and ritual and words themselves, and teachings, and all these things to kind of like mediate for us, to make it more intelligible to us. But as we study and as we grow, we begin to turn, and yes, the soul in the realm of materiality. Materiality itself is subject to the rhythms and cycles of the cosmos, and the rhythms and the cycles of the cosmos are replicated and designed into and manifested in the turning of the dance and the whole ritual of Same. And so the soul begins as it falls into alignment with the motion of the spheres. The soul begins to ascend into greater intimacy. The soul ascends toward the one, along the way toward the intellect. And so then the manifestations that are so intimate in the sensual world, their meaning becomes more and more real, and soon their meaning becomes all that there is. And this is the nature of intellect as it is understood in this form of understanding. Intellect is that which holds or beholds the meanings of things, the inner meanings of things. And then such terms as subjectivity and objectivity, even that stands in the way of the wordless whole. For how can that which emanates form, the one, how can its being be limited to any particular form? Much less the form of the human being that beholds these forms. And then the human being, responding to the designs of the structures that are mirrored in it, begins to, in its actions, begin to take part in these structures of the cosmos in a way that brings it closer and closer to the sources and to the essences and to the originals of things, and finds itself in the place of the intellect. But it doesn't stop there, right? This is only like the first. This is like the first salutation of the whirling, so to speak. The first salam is the soul awakening in love, in the creation world, and being created world, and being present to all of that. And then the second sema is through specialized exercises and activities, the soul begins to see more clearly through the opacity of the sensual world. And then the soul begins to see more. You see, this is like the second salutation, the second salam. And then intellect falls away, disappears into the source. And this is the third salam, the third salutation, which is fana, which is annihilation or absorption. What is in the Buddhist world, nirvana means extinguishment. And there's a lot of hyperbole about this, isn't there? Annihilation. Oh, how, you could throw that word around, and be pretty, postmodern, But it's, annihilation. The word is fana, and it means that subjectivity has fallen away, and objectivity also has fallen away. It is such that there is no separation. There's not like the you and the I. The and has fallen away. The I has fallen away. There's only you, and that is. And then the you itself falls away, and there's only that which is. Needless to say, it transcends words. This is the turning where the dervish is lost in the motions of the cosmos. But that's not all, of course. The fourth salam is the returning or the restoration. Because God said, I made the world so that I could be known. Human beings were given my nature so that they could behold that from which they came and return to that. And so the restoration is the fourth salam, where the dervish returns to the world. The dervish transmits, the divine being, from above, and gives it to the community. And then this is the movement that brings the dance to its completion, you see. These are the four turnings, or this is something of a description of what is happening there. And it is said, I mean, no matter what we say about whatever legendary kind of setting we give, if it's compelling to us, you know, the image of a tearful Rumi, you know, dancing around a pole to the clanging of the hammer of a goldsmith, you know, or we consider the pattern of the contemplations that are in the symbols and the images and the parables and the utterances and the teachings that Rumi gives, we can find ways that the universe is reflected as ideas. And we can see those ideas seen in actions, like the dance, as well as words, you see. So it becomes, you know, multiphasic, so to speak. And it is out of Rumi, you know, that we can contemplate these kinds of things. So how can it be then? When the soul is in a state of fauna, when the soul is in absorption into the divine being, so that there is no I nor you nor any of this, at that time, under that spell, is it not so that all dimensions of temporality have fallen away, and that there are no more veils, and then the utterances can be so, quote unquote, seeming relatively out of this world, that they can invite the wrath of institutional and orthodox authorities? Yes, that can happen, and it has happened many, many times. Sufis in ecstatic trances have uttered things in the marketplace that are blasphemous to conventional ears, and they have paid the price in a great many different ways, actually. So, when Shams of Tabriz asked a very loaded question to Rumi as he was holding his horse, O leader of the Muslims, who is greater? The Prophet, who said, we do not know you as we should, or Bayazid, who said, I am God, I am great, I am all, I am everything, who is greater? Perhaps you could look at it as a challenging kind of statement. Perhaps Shams was saying, you know, could it be that Bayazid was actually the one in unity with the divine, whereas Muhammad was only yearning after it? Well, Rumi's reply was very, very creative and very, very inclusive, and it incorporates so much more than a simple ecstatic state, and it's very important to understand it in that way. When Rumi replied, well, Bayazid was satisfied with one quaff. Bayazid was satisfied with the light that came through the opening only in his own dwelling, whereas the Prophet Muhammad thirsted for more thirst. There was never going to be enough, because the dimensions of how it would be satisfied would never contain. He could not be, he knew that the divine could not be limited to such a container as himself. And so this is why he said, we do not know thee as well as thou shouldst be known, when he said this of God. And so he was evoking also a long chain of succession of Sufi personages and Sufi lore and Sufi stories, tales of teachers, and very dramatic kind of states of consciousness, or the dramatization of many, many states of consciousness, sometimes, you know, in surreal kind of ways, and they're meant to be that way. It's not like you're not in kind of a world of literal understanding. You're looking at belief through other eyes, you must understand. If you want to look at these things in this way, you're entering through another doorway. You're taking the road less traveled in the nature of this, into the nature of divinity. But so, Rumi was referring to Bayazid. Shams was referring to Bayazid. Who is Bayazid? Well, Bayazid was a great inspiration to both Rumi and to Shams. Bayazid lived some years before, perhaps hundreds of years before, actually, I'm not sure. But Bayazid, yeah. Bayazid, like others, the most famous one is Halaj. who was drawn and quartered, for saying, I am one, I am God. Well, Bayazid, Halaj was drawn and quartered for doing that, but Bayazid, not so. Because Bayazid was hoeing a different row, so to speak. Bayazid, who was this Bayazid? Well, like I say, he was an inspiration to both Rumi and to Shams and to many, many others. And Bayazid himself was a teacher, inspiring to the contemporaries around him, sometimes in very unusual ways. Because he was known as one of those kinds of beings who were subject to mysterious states of mind falling upon them, where they would go into, especially late at night, they would go into these vast inner states of understanding and say inconceivable type things, sometimes blasphemous kind of things, which were hard to take because people took these terms very, very seriously, as you might understand. And yet, earlier in the evening, he was pretty normal. And so his students would come, they would gather around in the early evenings, and then they would stay until late at night, because the conversation, the sobhet, there is sameh, that's the ritualistic, artistic kind of aspect, of Sufi prayer. And there's also sobet, which is, conversation upon spiritual subjects, basically. And so the sobet would run the gamut with Bayazid from early in the evening, when he would offer advice and things like this, and answer questions in kind of a normal way until later on, when he would get kind of weird, as they say. For example, he would say, they would say earlier in the evening, a student might say, Bayazid, how did you become a Sufi? And Bayazid said, I searched and searched, and I offered up my piety and my good works and all of this. And then another student would say, teacher, said what the student would say to Bayazid in the course of sobet, of mystical conversation. Another student would pipe up and say, oh, teacher, I have been pious for so many years, and it brings me no nearer to God. How is it that you can be so near to God with piety? And then Bayazid said, he would say, it wasn't exactly piety, actually. Oh, yeah, I tried piety, and I tried goodness, and I tried all of this, and it left me bereft of God, until one day Allah spoke to me, and Allah said, as Allah said to Moses, when Moses admonished the shepherd, God said to Bayazid, why do you offer me piety? Don't you think I have enough of that? Too much of piety. I need something from you. And Bayazid said, God told me he needed something from me. And that was when I realized, I've got a broken heart. I've got neediness. I've got longing. I've got my plight. So I offered that to God. And that helped. I began to understand reality more then. And then they would say, but we've heard of your teacher, Abu Aziz. Oh, yes, said Bayazid. Yeah, yes. Another student said, how old are you anyway, Bayazid? Bayazid said, I'm 4 years old. And then a murmur went through, his students. He's starting to get weird, He's saying he's 4 years old. But Bayazid said, no, it might sound strange, but no. It was 4 years ago that I recognized in Abu Aziz, my teacher, when I really became fully enlightened through receiving that transmission from him. Oh, said another student, Bayazid, honored sir, was that then your greatest teacher? And Bayazid said, no. Actually, the greatest teacher I ever had was my mother. And people, oh, really? Yeah. How did it happen? Bayazid, I did not know your mother was a Sufi. And Bayazid said, well, my mother was thirsty. It was late at night, and my mother was thirsty. And it was the middle of the night, and she wanted a drink of water. So I went to get her a drink of water. I went to the jug. There was no water in the jug in our dwelling. I went to the bucket. There was no water in the bucket in our dwelling. So On a moonless night, I had to go out into the dark, down to the spring, and I had to bring back a jar of water from the spring. And when I got back inside and came to the bedside of my mother, she was fast asleep. So I waited by her bedside. And when the dawn came through the window, she opened up her eyes and she saw the water, and she was so glad. She drank the water and she thanked me profusely. Especially, she was astounded when she realized I had been up by the night as she slept. And after that, she prayed for me. And it was only then that I found my way. Before that, nothing was working. But it is in this way that my mother's thirst occasioned the time and the place and the event that crystallized my understanding as something of the terms that he might have said. And then he started getting weird as the evening progressed. He began to speak less, and I don't know, his breathing kind of changed. You could tell that he still wanted people in the room. And it wasn't like a seance or anything like that, but his head went forward. And then he spoke, and he said, somebody asked me an hour ago, how long does it take to get enlightened? It takes many, many turnings. A flower such as I am in the garden of God takes hundreds of years to be that flower. And then he didn't speak for a longer time. And then deep into the night, that's when he started to say, "Oh God, take from me the word and. For when I hear you and I feel the gulf of this word and I. Take it away. Oh God, take away this I, take away the and, take away the I." And then he didn't speak for a long time, an even longer time this time. And then that's when he began to say, God is in my hair. God is in my nostrils. God is in my fingernails. God is in my eyebrows. God is in every particle of me, every atom of me, every pulse of my blood. I am God. And people were shocked. His students were shocked. And then sometime after that, the dawn came, and he went off to bed, and they went home to go about their daily business. And when they assembled next time, whether it was the next night or maybe sometime later, they probably gathered, regularly for Sobhet, for mystical conversation. And one of the students, said, "Teacher, I must be very frank with you, but at a certain point in our previous meeting, you were saying blasphemous things." "What? What was I saying?" said Bayezid. And the student said, "Oh, you were saying that you were God." And Bayezid said, "This, Bayezid, so full of murkiness, so full of anger, so full of delusion, it is impossible. It is wrong for this Bayezid to say that he is God. What should we do, teacher, if you start saying something like that?" And Bayezid said, "Bring your knives and daggers. And if I begin to speak in blasphemies, in order to save my soul, I want you to stab me so that I die, in order to save my soul from perdition." And so the next meeting, they brought their daggers and their knives. And he entered into a state of Sobet, and it began in kind of the same way. He was talking about the ages of labor that it took for any manifestation of individuality of any particle, of anything in this world. The unseen labor that brings it about is utterly unique to itself. So why not I, Bayezid, would be every bit as unique as God is? Oh. And then, of course, then the long silence. And then, I am God. I am light. I am darkness. I am the sun and the moon and the earth. I am everything. And of course, the students, they took him at his word. they took out their knives and their daggers, and they approached him to stab. And they did stab, and the one that stabbed his breast felt a gash in his own chest, and Bayezid was unmarked. And the one who slashed at Bayezid's throat felt a pain in his own throat, and Bayezid was unhurt. And the ones who stabbed at his feet or his legs felt pain, stabbing pain in their own feet and legs. The same with the ones who stabbed at every other part of his body. Every move they made to harm him, they felt the pain themselves. You see how surreal. But they realized, Bayezid's mental state is given to us for us to understand. And what we understand is that Bayezid is a mirror of the divine reality. And we look into the mirror and we see ourselves. And what we do to the mirror of divine reality, we do to ourselves. It is such that we understand the likeness of that which we see to what is, but it still remains only a likeness. And so what we do to the likeness, we do to ourselves, because we ourselves are likenesses. And if we are likenesses, then what are we really? And this is a good question that they had. And Bayezid conjured up the circumstances where it could be illustrated to them, you see. And so this is the way that Bayezid operated. But now, Muhammad, the prophet, it was not that his teaching denied the existence of such states, but it's more like that's only one part of the path to the whole, you see. The veils falling away and the divine knowledge, that's there to serve its purpose, you see. That's there to serve its purpose, but in truth, things are much more mysterious than that. One of the stories told of the prophet was this. He was traveling with some of his disciples, Muhammad was, and they stopped at an oasis, and it was springtime, and there were some luscious white dates, and there was fresh goat's milk, and the palm trees were waving in the wind, and it was a very pleasant evening. And suddenly one of the disciples of Muhammad stood up and said, "Muhammad, your great-grandfather Hashim was a vicious and ugly man, and all of his descendants are vicious and ugly as well." And his hand was on his sword as he said this. And as soon as he said that, another of Muhammad's disciples, rose to his feet and said, "Oh, my sword will drink your blood. How dare you speak to Muhammad, our prophet, in such a way?" And Muhammad himself, he said to the one who had cursed him, he said, "You are right. You are right." And as soon as he said that, the one who drawn his sword against the one who cursed him put his sword down, put it back in its sheath. And the one who'd cursed him put his sword back in his sheath and sat down. And then they continue eating their dates and fresh goat's milk. And then I think it was Abu Bakr said, wanting perhaps to make things right, he said, "Oh, Prophet, actually your great-grandfather Hashim was a noble and great man, a storehouse of virtue and bravery, and all of his descendants are likewise great paragons of courage and virtue." And Muhammad said, "Abu Bakr, you are right." And the one who had drawn his sword, he's kind of like St. Peter, right? You see the parallel, the hothead. The one who had drawn his sword, thinking that he was going to slay the slanderer of the prophet, said to the prophet, "How could they both be right? How could the one who says that your great-grandfather is bad be right, and the one who says your great-grandfather is good be right? How could they both be right?" And Muhammad said, "Understand, Haider," I think his name was Haider, "understand, I am a mirror. I am a mirror. One who has a blue glass in front of them will see blue. One who has a red glass in front of them will see red." And then Haider asked a good question. He said, "Well, how then are we to be if both of these things are true?" And Muhammad said, "People will see what they see based on their own way of looking. What we are called to be is to polish our inner being such that it shines as a mirror to those who see it as a mirror, but that a pure, nameless, imageless light shines out of it. And it is that in which people can see their real selves, as well as the way in which you yourself can show your real nature by polishing it to such a degree that it becomes a purity that is only imaged by a mirror in this world. You see, this was one of the teachings of Muhammad, involving mirrors. Yes, Konya was a cosmopolitan place now. And Rumi spent his time, teaching, and there were Jews and there were Christians and there were Zoroastrians and there were many, and they lived, and they got along, and they flourished. And at the same time, Jalaluddin was always, he was always an observant Muslim, and yet at the same time, it was the verses in the Quran that showed how the uniqueness of each individual is part of the being of God, and that uniqueness is expressed in all the different ways of worship there are. Right, many pathways to the garden, or I look into the churches, into the synagogues, into the madrasas, into the all the churches, and all the synagogues and all the mosques, and I see one altar. It is toward that one. Oneness is one. The nature of God is one. There are many ways to worship, and so we take that ball and run with it, and that's fine and good, but in doing so in our secular world, it is possible to us. I think that we have the conceptual freedom, or the potentiality of the conventional freedom, to allow ourselves to experience the uniqueness of each, not only cultural context, but just each context of an individual, a transient appearance. An individual is, living in a transient kind of world, and each expression is both universal and particular. It's just that one must learn to see it. One must polish the mirror of the heart. So here's something in the Mathnawi that I will tell you about, and then then it will be time for us to make our turns, into this universe. It was such that there were two schools of artists, from the East and from the West. And it was decided by the Sultan to have a contest at last to see which clique of artists, which school of artists could demonstrate the greater degree, the greater work of skill and beauty. And so it so happened that the Sultan had two houses out on the edge of town, and nobody was living in those houses. And so he invited a group of artists from the East into one house, and he invited a group of artists from the West into the other house. And he told them, separate your houses by a curtain, and you have access to all the materials that you need to make a work of art. And when the time comes, we will draw the curtains aside, and I and all of the people will be able to see which artwork is more magnificent. Will it be of you of the artists of the East, or you of the artists of the West? And so everyone accepted the challenge. And the artists of the East, they ordered the best paints and brushes and materials, and they began to go to work painting designs and images on the wall. There was a curtain, though, you couldn't see what they were doing. But as for the curtain over the house of the artists of the West, they had brought their own materials with them. And people weren't sure, but they could hear with their ears. They could hear the sound of grinding going on behind the curtains. And it seemed that there was some kind of polishing going on, some kind of grinding away, right? Some kind of buffing up going on of some kind. And then the time passed, and the day came for the revelation, for the veils to be drawn away, and the veils were drawn away. And first the veil of the artists of the East was drawn away. The curtain fell, and the wall was covered with scenes of such beauty, forests and meadows, and springs and flowers and gardens and palaces. But not only that, there were abstract designs as well, beautiful shapes and figures in all these proportions that were intricately drawn and made. And everyone gasped. And the Sultan thought, well, how can this be bettered? Let the curtain fall upon the house of the artists of the West. And so the curtain fell. And what they saw on the other side was a mirror image of what was on the wall of the artists of the East. Yes, a mirror image. Everything that was painted there appeared on that wall. For you see, the artists of the West had grinded and buffed away the surfaces so that the wall was like a perfect mirror, and it reflected everything that was upon it. And it was, everyone understood that what the artists of the West had done was in effacing what was there, they allowed for a different dimension of seeing and understanding to be exemplified in the images that they saw as reflections. See, so in this way, it says something very, very specific about all the ways that we see and all the things that we strive to understand. So it's like the Mathnawi on all the stories, and I've told you only a few. It's like a delta. It's like a river approaching the sea in many, many different ways, and it's a breathing landscape. Things turn and they fulfill, and then they turn into other things which fulfill in their way as well. And it's intricate and ongoing, and it can never be fully described. And words are only a partial step toward it, you see. And so in this way, I think Rumi's gift is tremendous, because it brings us a furthering, of what words can do and what words cannot do. And so, okay. So on that point, I would like to read you a poem from Walt Whitman. Because Walt Whitman, in his poetic vision, transcended time and space in his way too. And yet his language is so colloquial and so homely. But he knew about the Sufis. Walt Whitman wrote this poem. It is called A Persian Lesson. A Persian Lesson by Walt Whitman. He wrote it later on in his life. He was quite old when he wrote this. For his overarching and last lesson, the graybeard Sufi, in the fresh scent of the morning, in the open air, on the slope of a teeming Persian rose garden, under an ancient chestnut tree, wide spreading its branches, spoke to the young priests and students. Finally, my children, to envelope each word, each part of the rest, Allah is all, is immanent in every life and object, maybe at many and many a more removes. Yet Allah is there. Has the astray wandered far? Is the reason why strangely hidden? Would you sound below the restless ocean of the entire world? Would you know the dissatisfaction, the urge and spur of every life, the something never stilled, never entirely gone, the invisible need of every seed? It is the central urge in every atom, often unconscious, often evil, downfallen, to return to its divine source and origin, however distant, latent, the same, in subject and in object, without one exception. This is the Persian lesson by Walt Whitman. And so already you see the universality, jumped its cage long ago. The universality jumped its cage in the whirling of the dervishes. It jumped its cage, from the Persian and the Arabic, and it jumped its cage from the Victorian translations. And yes, it even jumped its cage from the free verse interpretations of the 1970s. And yes, it jumps its cage even now, for that is its nature. You see, wisdom such as this overleaps itself always in its forms, and to remind us of our own overleaping kind of nature. There's always it is this way, and always it has been this way. So in a way, it's returning. This is the nature of the one as it utters the world, and each of us, of course, is doing that always in our own selves, for we are making up the world, and always have been, as all human beings before us and all those to come, you see, making up the world. So let it be a good one that reflects the reality of things. You see, on that note, then, I wish you a happy turning, a happy Urs of Rumi, a happy solstice or equinox. It's a solstice, and all of this, and a happy holiday, of course. And let us consider these things in our minds, and it will feed our sense of truth and beauty and all this goodness, right? And so that's the message then. I thank you for your heroic listening, and I say to you, so long for now.